Well, Isaac was an older contemporary of the Venerable Bede in England, so 7th century. We don't know when he was born. In fact, we know very little about his life, but he must have been born around about 640, and we've no idea when he died. The only point that we do know is that in 676, the Patriarch of the Church of the East visited the Qatar region, the Gulf state of Qatar, and that vicinity, and chose Isaac to become a bishop of Nineveh, which is modern Mosul. He took Isaac with him back to Mesopotamia, and Isaac was bishop of Nineveh for 5 months, and then he resigned for reasons which his biographer says, oh, God only knows. And he retired to the desert, i.e. the mountain wilderness of Khuzestan, that's south east Iraq, southwest Iran. And he was attached there to a monastery of Rabban Shabor, who was a monk of previous generation who founded the monastery. This is probably, we don't know the site exactly, but it was probably in southwest Iran rather than Iraq. It was in the mountains, certainly. And is said to have died at an old age, and he'd already gone blind. And it's quite possible that many of his discourses, of which there are a large number come down to us, were written from dictation. And indeed, the rather curious syntax does suggest this sometimes. And they're often quite difficult to translate as a result. Well, he left a huge amount of writings on the monastic life. One should remember that he's writing in the very first century of Islam, but you'd never have an inkling that this was so from his writings, which are addressed to monks and are on the spiritual life. We have at least 3 collections of his works, one of which has been known for a long time, and that was translated into Greek around about 800 in Palestine at the monastery of St. Saba, and that was the source of a Latin translation in the Middle Ages and Slavonic translations about the same time in Church Slavonic, and then much later into Russian. And if anyone's read the brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima is partly based on Isaac's teaching, or monastic teaching. So he was clearly very influential, especially in Russia, and Dostoevsky clearly was very keen on Isaac's writings. Quite recently, I mean, within a few decades, 2 more collections were discovered. The first collection has 80 odd discourses. The second collection, which I happened to come across in the Bodleian Library in Oxford in the 1980s, I suppose it was, has 41 actually discourses. And the third collection, which turned up shortly after that, in a manuscript in Tehran, belonging to the Chaldean bishop, that has a rather smaller number. I'm pretty sure all these new discourses are by Isaac, with perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, 1 or 2 discourses. There's one in the third collection, which is actually in verse, and elsewhere it's attributed to Ephraim, but in fact it's very unlikely it belongs either to Ephraim or to Isaac. It's a very nice piece, but it's totally out of character of what Isaac is writing elsewhere. So, especially through the first part, Isaac has been extremely influential in the Orthodox world, and his still favorite reading on Mount Athos, and in the Russian world too, Russian-speaking, Slavonic-speaking world, Romania too. I think the real key is his view of the limitless love of God. And this is sort of overriding all his thought. And this overriding love is, as he stresses on many occasions, an equal love which applies to sinners just as much as to the righteous. So it's an overall love, but at the same time, it's an immensely compassionate love. And I suppose you could say that Isaac sees the need for humanity, well, the prime need for humanity is to respond to this limitless love. And that also is a response to compassion. And there's some wonderful passages about the compassionate life of someone who is responding in this way. I might read you one if I may. It's a very famous passage. There's a question. An elder once asked, "What is a compassionate heart?" And he, that's Isaac, replied, "It is a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, for the demons, and for all that exists. At the recollection and at the sight of them, such a person's eyes overflow with tears, owing to the vehemence of the compassion which grips their heart. As a result of their deep mercy, their heart shrinks and cannot bear to hear or look on any injury or the slightest suffering of anything in creation. That is why this person constantly offers up prayer full of tears, even for the irrational animals and for the enemies of truth, and even for those who harm him, so that they may be protected and find mercy." And then he adds, rather curiously at the end, he even prays for the reptiles as a result of the great compassion which is poured out beyond measure after the likeness of God in his heart. So this compassion is a reflection of divine compassion, which extends even to the reptiles. And that's probably a reflection of the society in which Isaac was living, because Isaac's living outside the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, in what had been the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, where the official religion was Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is a dualist religion where the creation is partly good and partly bad, and serpents belong to the bad part. So this is a deliberate statement on Isaac's part that divine compassion extends, and human compassion extends even to the snakes and serpents, which, according to his Zoroastrian compatriots, shouldn't be recipients of such compassion. So this compassionate love, limitless compassionate love, is the focal point, I think, of Isaac's thought, and how to respond to it. It's also a response to the love that produces the incarnation. And one of the remarkable things about Isaac's thought is that the reason for the incarnation is not to make a recompense for human sin. It's simply a demonstration of divine love, which underpins humanity and sinks, as it were, sort of underpins it, going to the right of the depths of all that's gone wrong with humanity. So ending up crucified as a criminal. And it's this immensity of divine love that is behind the mystery of the incarnation. So it's divine humility. At one point, Isaac says, "Humility is the robe of divinity, For when God the Word became incarnate, he put on humility and thereby communicated with us by means of our human body. Accordingly, everyone who is truly clothed in humility will resemble him who descended from the height, hiding the radiance of his greatness and covering up his glory by means of his lower state. So he has a great deal about humility. And this is just not the ordinary sort of humility that one knows of, but it's a profound humility where the person with such humility thinks that they are worse than even the worst of criminals. So again, it's this idea of underpinning the lowest that humanity can go. And that, I think, is a very important idea in a lot of Syriac thought, but it's very prominent in Isaac's idea. And love of neighbor, which of course is the second commandment, that too is very prominent. And Isaac several times says, if you don't love your neighbor, you can't possibly reflect any love of God, since God's love includes love for your neighbor. So these two aspects, immense love and immense compassion, which in order to reflect it requires deep humility, profound humility. And some people found this, and both ancients and modern people found this great emphasis of God's compassion as in conflict with God's justice. Isaac on several occasions tries to deal with this and pointing out that if you put justice and compassion on two bowls of scales, the balances, the compassion will far outweigh the justice. So for those who like justice, Isaac is a writer whom they will not so much appreciate. But the compassion sort of overrides justice. There is justice, of course, but it's overridden by compassion. Isaac, I would say, quite definitely was a universalist in that he believed in a final restoration and that divine love, which had created the world, would overcome all evil. And he points out that evil only entered into creation at a secondary stage. So it's a secondary element which can come to an end. Since it comes into being, it can also come to an end. And he has hints of this view in the first collection of writings. He says, sin, Gehenna, that's hell, and death do not exist at all with God, since they are effects and not substances. So they're part of the secondary element within creation. Sin is the fruit of self-will. There was a time when sin did not exist, and there will be a time when it will not exist. Gehenna is the fruit of sin. At some point in time, it had a beginning, but its end is not known. Death, however, is a dispensation of the Creator's wisdom. It will rule only a certain time over nature, and then it will certainly disappear. Now, in the second part, right at the end, he has much more about this. And basically what he's saying, that if Gehenna is eternal, which is in a way traditional teaching in many churches, then God's love is defeated, since God's love intends to save humanity. So this is, I suppose, the basic point that he makes out. And I'll read a few passages from Isaac himself, from the second part, because I think these will make it clear how he views these things. In love did God bring the world into existence. In love does he guide it through its temporal existence. In love, he is going to bring it to that wondrous transformed state, and in love will the world be swallowed up in the great mystery of him who has performed all these things. In love will the whole course of the governance of creation be finally comprised. And then slightly further on in that chapter, he says, but we know that everyone is agreed in this, that there is no change or any earlier or later intentions with the Creator. There is no hatred or resentment in his nature, no greater or lesser place in his love, no before or after in his knowledge. For if it is believed by everyone that the creation came into existence as a result of the Creator's goodness and love, then we know that this original cause does not ever diminish or change in the Creator's nature as a result of the disordered course of creation. So the disorderliness is a secondary element. And one thing he is very emphatic about is that Gehenna is absolutely terrible, but it is not a form of retribution on God's part. It's really brought upon the victims of Gehenna by themselves, being the realization sudden realization of their previous denial of, or unawareness of the immensity of God's love. And so, in a way, they are judging themselves. And this is an idea that goes back, in fact, to Ephraim, that to judgment, all your bad thoughts and bad actions will suddenly materialize before your face and accuse you. So it's this self-realization of where everything's gone wrong. And so this is definitely not a matter of God's revenge or anger or jealousy or anything. And Isaac says in another passage towards the end of the second collection, that we should imagine that anger, wrath, jealousy, or the suchlike have anything to do with the divine nature is something utterly abhorrent for us. No one in their right mind, no one who has any understanding at all, can possibly come to such madness as to think anything of the sort about God. Nor again can we possibly say that he acts thus out of retribution, even though the scriptures may on the outer surface posit this. Even to think of this of God and to suppose that retribution for evil acts is to be found with him is an abominable thought. By implying that he makes use of such great and difficult thing, that's Gehenna, out of retribution, we are attributing a weakness to the divine nature. We cannot even believe such a thing can be found in those human beings who live a virtuous and upright life and whose thoughts are entirely in accord with the divine will, let alone believe it of God. I'll just read one more passage, which brings this out. He's obviously speaking to people who might doubt what he's saying. He says, let us beware in ourselves, my beloved, and realize that even if Gehenna is subject to a limit, the taste of its experience is most terrible, and the extent of its bounds escapes our very understanding. Let us strive all the more to partake of the taste of God's love for the sake of perpetual reflection on him, and let us not have experience of Gehenna through neglect. So Gehenna is certainly very much existing in Isaac's mind, but he thinks there is some mystery that it will come to end. He speaks of it as a mystery, and he doesn't know what will happen, but there is something in the divine purpose, he is confident, that will, in effect, bring it to an end and bring everything to a restoration, not just of what was before the fall, but of something far more glorious, and sort of an awareness of this divine immensity of love. So this is an aspect of Isaac's teaching which has already in his own day caused problems with people who thought Gehenna should be eternal, because of various gospel sayings, which you can understand in different ways, and of course in modern times. And when the second part was published, there were people in both the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, rather conservative quarters, who claimed that this second part cannot have been by Isaac of the first part. But in fact, that is, you can't claim that at all. You have to accept Isaac as he stands, because there are hints of his position already in the first part. And if you accept the first part, you really need to accept the second part.